My name is Camille Osei. I'm 30 years old. And the night my brother looked across the dinner table and told me that unmarried women don't need savings was the night I finally understood that the family I had grown up in had been keeping two separate ledgers for 30 years, one for what I was worth to them, and one for what they believed I was worth to myself. He said it in front of 8 people. My parents, my aunt and her husband, my brother's girlfriend Nadia, my cousin Theo, and me. My grandmother's table, which fit 10 when the extension leaf was in, and which my mother had laid with the good linen because it was the Sunday before Christmas, and she treated the Sunday before Christmas the way some people treat the holiday itself. "You're single," my brother said. His name is Daniel. He is 3 years older than me and has the particular confidence of someone who has never been asked to justify it. "You don't need that much saved. Give it to mom and dad. It's not like you have a family depending on it." My mother smiled the way she smiled when Daniel said something she agreed with, but had not wanted to say herself. My father set his fork down and said, "He's right. It's practical, Camille. You have no dependents. Your parents do." I looked at the table for a moment. Then I folded my napkin, placed it beside my plate, and said, "No." One word. No rise in my voice. No explanation appended to it. Daniel's girlfriend looked at the centerpiece. What none of them knew, what I had not told any of them, because it had never come up in a way that made telling them necessary, was that the house they were sitting in had only one name on the lease. Mine. And it had been that way for 3 years. I grew up in a house that ran on a particular kind of love, present, genuine, and distributed according to a logic that nobody had designed and nobody had examined. My parents, Abina and Kofi Osei, had come to this country from Ghana in their early 30s with 2 children, a container of furniture, and the specific kind of practical optimism that belongs to people who have moved their entire lives across an ocean and consider that a reasonable thing to have done. My father had retrained as an electrician. My mother had managed the household and, once Daniel and I were in secondary school, worked part-time at the front desk of a dental office, a job she valued for its hours and its proximity to people, and which she held for 11 years. They had not been wealthy in the years I was growing up. They had been careful. There was a difference in that household between a want and a need that was enforced without drama, not as deprivation, but as the operating assumption of a family that had a limited margin and treated that margin with respect. I had absorbed this. I had grown up understanding that money was not a subject of embarrassment, but of management, and that management required attention. Daniel had absorbed something different. Not because my parents had taught him differently, they hadn't deliberately, but because Daniel had grown up in the particular position of a firstborn son in a family where the firstborn son was, without discussion, the one the family oriented toward. This had nothing to do with my parents' love for me, which was real and consistent. It had to do with a framework they had inherited from their own parents and had never once stopped to examine, that the son's trajectory was the family's project and that the daughter's trajectory was, in a quieter way, secondary. This produced, over the years, a set of outcomes that I would not have been able to articulate at 15 but understood very clearly at 27. Daniel's university fees were funded from the family's savings without discussion. Mine were funded from a combination of a partial scholarship, a part-time job at a campus bookstore, and a government loan I spent 3 years paying off. Daniel's first car was a gift from my parents on his 25th birthday. I bought my own car at 24 from money I had set aside over 2 years. When Daniel moved into his first apartment, my mother furnished it. When I moved into mine, she gave me a set of towels and a dinner plate she had liked the pattern of. None of this was delivered with malice. That is the important thing. Each individual decision had its own logic. The scholarship covered most of my fees. The loan was small. I had a job, so the car was something I could manage. Daniel's apartment was his first time living alone, and he needed a start. Mine was later, and I had been more prepared. Each decision was reasonable in isolation. The pattern they formed over 15 years was something else. I had become, by my late 20s, a person who handled her own things. Not because the family had thrown me out to manage alone, but because the family had consistently assumed I could, and acted accordingly, and the assumption had become self-fulfilling. I had a stable job. I worked as a procurement coordinator for a regional hospital network, a role that required the particular combination of organizational precision and relationship management that I had, over 4 years, become genuinely good at. I had a savings account I contributed to monthly. I had a budget I kept in a spreadsheet on my laptop and reviewed every quarter. I had a car that was paid off and an emergency fund that had never been touched. What I also had, which my family did not know I had, was the lease. The lease was not a secret in the way a deception is a secret. It was simply a fact that had never come up in conversation because the specific conversation that would have made it relevant had never happened until the Sunday before Christmas, when Daniel reached across the good linen and told me what kind of savings a woman in my position needed. The lease had begun 3 years prior, under circumstances that I should explain. My parents had rented the same house in the Elmwood district for 14 years. The house was a 2-story semi-detached property with 3 bedrooms, a rear garden, and the particular quality that houses acquire after 14 years of a single family's occupancy: the arrangement of furniture that has found its permanent place, the specific combination of smells from the kitchen that means home, the marks on the doorframe where my mother had recorded Daniel's height and mine every birthday until we were too old to stand still for it. The landlord for the first 12 of those 14 years had been a man named Mr. Teta, a retired civil servant who had owned the property as an investment and who had managed it with the benign inattention of someone who had other things to think about. He had kept the rent stable and the communication minimal and had, in 12 years, required 2 maintenance interventions, a boiler replacement and a roof repair, both of which he had arranged without complaint. Mr. Teta had died 2 years before the Christmas dinner. His estate had passed to his daughter, a property solicitor named Adwoa Teta, who had handled the inheritance with the efficiency of her profession and had, within 4 months of her father's death, reviewed the property portfolio and notified my parents that the lease would be restructured at renewal, moved to a formal tenancy agreement, with a rent adjustment reflecting current market rates, and the requirement that the named tenant provide documentation of income sufficient to support the new rental figure. My parents had reviewed the new rental figure. My father had sat at the kitchen table with the letter from Adwoa Teta's office and had done the arithmetic twice. The income documentation requirement was the problem. My father had retired from electrical work 2 years prior, following a shoulder injury that had made the physical demands of the job unsustainable. His pension was modest. My mother's dental office hours had been reduced to 2 days a week when the practice had downsized. Their combined documented income, at the point of the lease renewal, was below the threshold the new agreement required. My father had called me on a Wednesday evening. He had explained the situation with the directness he used for practical problems. No softening, no apology, just the facts in the order they were relevant. He said the rental threshold required a guarantor or a named tenant with sufficient income. He said Daniel's income was inconsistent. Daniel was working as a freelance web developer, and his documented earnings in the prior tax year had been irregular. He said he was calling me because I had the employment record. I had asked him how long he needed. He said the lease was a 3-year term. I had taken 2 days to think about it. I had reviewed the rental figure, confirmed that it was within the range I could support on paper without committing my own funds to it, and called Adwoa Teta's office to discuss the process. Her assistant, a man named Patrick Hardy, had walked me through the documentation requirements. I had submitted my employment verification and income documentation from Heartland Regional Health, the hospital network where I worked. The lease had been drawn up in my name. I had not told my parents what the process had involved. I had told my father the lease was sorted, and he had said thank you, and that had been the extent of it. I had not told Daniel at all. The lease sat in a folder on my laptop, alongside my own tenancy agreement, my car insurance documents, and my employment contract. It was not a weapon. It was a document. It had a renewal date. It required my signature to continue. In the 3 years between the lease signing and the Christmas dinner, the subject of my savings had come up twice in family contexts. Once when Daniel had mentioned, in passing, that I must be doing well if I was putting away a regular amount each month, and once when my mother had asked, with a combination of genuine interest and mild pressure that she applied to certain subjects, whether I had thought about buying a property of my own. Neither conversation had led anywhere significant. The Christmas dinner conversation was different in kind, because it was public. Daniel had not asked me privately. He had made a statement at a table of 8 people about the appropriate financial behavior of an unmarried woman and had presented it not as an opinion but as a self-evident practical arrangement. The social architecture of the moment was designed to make disagreement difficult, not through aggression, but through the assumption that the reasonableness of the position was obvious to everyone present. My mother's smile confirmed the reasonableness. My father's agreement confirmed the reasonableness. The table's orientation toward the centerpiece confirmed the social cost of disagreement. I said no. I folded my napkin and placed it beside my plate with the same care I would give any object that was in the wrong position, and I said the word without inflection, without apology, and without the qualifying sentence that the moment's social architecture was waiting for. Daniel looked at me. "That's all," he said. "Yes," I said. My aunt's husband cleared his throat and reached for the serving dish. The conversation moved on. My mother asked my cousin Theo about his work. The centerpiece remained undiscussed. The evening continued with the particular forward motion of a family that has learned to absorb moments of friction without naming them. I drove home at 9:47. I made tea. I sat at my kitchen table for a while with the mug in both hands, not thinking about anything in particular, and then I went to bed. The lease renewal notice arrived 6 weeks later, in the second week of February, addressed to me at my apartment. I had known it was coming. Adwoa Tedamensa's office sent renewal notices 90 days before the term end, and I had noted the date in my calendar the prior autumn. The envelope was standard business correspondence, white, with the Tedamensa Property Management letterhead in the top left corner. It contained the renewal terms, the new rental figure, and a cover letter requesting my confirmation and signature by the end of the month. I read it at my kitchen table on a Tuesday morning, before work. The new rental figure was a 4% increase over the current rate, consistent with the market adjustment clause in the original agreement. The terms were otherwise unchanged. I set it down on the table. I went to work. That evening, I called my parents. My father answered. I told him the lease renewal had arrived. I told him the new figure. I told him the terms were otherwise unchanged from the current agreement. He said, "Good. When do you need to sign?" I told him by the end of the month. He said, "I'll let your mother know." I said, "Dad, I want to talk about something first." A pause. The quality of a pause from my father was always informative. He paused differently when he was recalibrating versus when he was simply thinking. This one had the texture of recalibration. I told him I was going to sign the renewal. I told him the house was not in question. I also told him that the conversation at the Christmas dinner had been sitting with me for 6 weeks, and that before I signed, I wanted to have a direct conversation about what the arrangement actually was. He said, "What do you mean, what the arrangement is?" I said, "My name is on the lease. It has been for 3 years. Daniel's name is not on it. Yours is not on it. If I don't sign the renewal, the tenancy doesn't continue. I want us to be clear about that." The pause this time was longer. He said, "We know you signed the lease, Camille." I said, "I don't think everyone at that table 6 weeks ago knew what that meant." He didn't answer immediately. I said, "I'm not making a threat. I'm going to sign the renewal because this is your home, and that doesn't change. But I want the family to understand that the savings Daniel said I didn't need were built by someone who also happens to be the named tenant on your lease, and those two things are related. The ability to carry that responsibility comes from the same financial discipline he told me to give up." My father was quiet for a moment that had a specific weight. He said, "I hear you." I said, "That's all I needed." He said, "I'll talk to your mother." We talked for a few more minutes about the renewal process, about whether the boiler had been serviced recently, about a property maintenance item I should flag with Patrick Hardy's office. Then we said goodnight. My father did talk to my mother. I know this because my mother called me 2 days later in the morning at a time she did not usually call. She did not open with the lease. She asked about my week. She asked about a work project I had mentioned at Christmas. Then she said, "Your father told me what you said." I waited. She said, "I didn't know it was only in your name." I told her I had assumed she knew. She said, "Your father handled it. I didn't look at the paperwork." I told her that was understandable. She said, I want you to know I didn't mean at the dinner when I smiled. I wasn't agreeing with everything he said. She stopped. I said, I know. She said, you've always been so capable that it's easy to forget to look at what the capable one is carrying. I held that sentence for a moment without responding to it. Then I said, that's exactly it. She said, I'm sorry, Camille. I told her I appreciated that. I told her the lease was fine, the renewal was going to be signed, the house was not going anywhere. I told her the conversation was the thing I had needed. We talked for another 10 minutes about nothing in particular, and then said goodbye. I told Daniel about the lease at the next family gathering, which was a birthday dinner for my mother in April. I did not make an announcement. I did not wait for a moment designed for it. He asked me at one point whether I had ever thought about buying, the way he sometimes asked me things he already had an opinion about. I said I hadn't ruled it out. I said my current financial commitments made the timing complicated. He asked what financial commitments. I said I was the named tenant on the family home lease and had been for 3 years. Daniel's girlfriend Nadia set her glass down. Daniel looked at me. I said, it's fine. I'm renewing. I just thought you should know. He said, why didn't you say something? I told him it hadn't come up. He was quiet for a moment. His jaw moved once without producing a word. Nadia looked at the table. My mother, from the other end, said, Camille, could you pass the rice? I passed the rice. The evening continued. Daniel did not bring up savings for the rest of it. He did not bring up savings at the gathering after that or the one after that. The subject has not come up at a family dinner in the month since. The lease renewal was signed on the 23rd of February. I sent the executed document to Patrick Carty's office by the end of the week. He sent a confirmation email with the new term dates and the updated rental schedule. I filed it in the folder on my laptop next to the original. There was nothing dramatic in the signing. I sat at my kitchen table on a Tuesday evening, read the document once through, signed where indicated, and scanned it from my printer. It took 11 minutes. I made dinner afterward. I want to tell you something about the word I said at the Christmas table because I think about it sometimes in the specific way you think about a small action whose consequences turned out to be larger than the action itself. I said no. One syllable. No argument attached to it, no explanation, no list of reasons assembled in advance for the occasion. The social architecture of the moment expected compliance, or at minimum a softened counteroffer. A maybe, a we'll see, a let me think about that. What it received was a complete sentence with no qualifications. The no did not resolve everything. It did not change my brother's framework overnight or produce an apology from the table. It did not announce the lease or explain my finances or demand acknowledgement. It was simply a refusal to agree to a premise, the premise that my savings were available to the family because I had not yet acquired the kind of life that made them mine by right. The premise was wrong. It had been wrong for 30 years. The lease was not the proof of that. The lease was just the most recent document. The proof was the car I had bought at 24 and the loan I had paid off without help and the emergency fund that had never been touched and the 4 years of quarterly budget reviews at my kitchen table and the particular financial discipline that Daniel had told a table of 8 people I should abandon because I was single. What the lease did was make the premise impossible to maintain without acknowledging the contradiction. You cannot tell someone their savings are available to the family because they have no dependents and also be dependent on their signature for the roof over your head. Those two positions cannot occupy the same room. When they tried to, one of them had to leave. It turned out to be the premise. Not loudly. Not at once. Just over the course of a few conversations and a letter and a birthday dinner and a past dish of rice, the premise quietly revised itself into something that could stand alongside the facts. A no is not a wall. It is a boundary marker, a post in the ground that says, here is where the map changes. What's on the other side is not emptiness. It's just a different piece of ground, one where the rules are clear and the person who set the marker knows exactly where she stands. Before I go, I want to ask you something specific, and I mean it specifically about this story. At the Christmas table, when I folded my napkin and said no, 8 people were in that room. My parents, my aunt and her husband, my cousin Theo, My brother's girlfriend Nadia. My brother.
Me.
None of them knew about the lease. When you were listening to that scene, was there a moment before I told you, a detail, a line, a beat, where you felt something didn't add up? Where you thought, she knows something they don't? Tell me in the comments. I read everyone. If this stayed with you, subscribe. There are more voices here, and every one of them knows exactly where the marker is. I'll see you in the next one.